Open the book, my friend. Let's dive in once again. Fill the pages with your hands. Let's talk until we understand. Chapter 1, here we go. Stories flourish and they grow. Lost in words, a world unfolds. Let's get ready for the show. Pages turning late at night. Words we ponder in soft light. Conversations deep and free. On this podcast, just you and me.
Welcome to episode 2 of the 2024 Academic Summer Podcast Series, Delving into Solar Storms by Linda Hogan. I am your host, Jared Stewart. We thank you for listening and hope this series helps you as you prepare for upcoming competitions. This episode will focus on chapters 7 through 14. Chapter 7 gives us some insight into the trauma Angel's mother endured and the mental health issues she's dealt with, which will become important when Angel meets her later in the book. Chapter 8, Bush gives us more details of Hannah's mental illness as it relates to Angel and her inability to be a mother. Chapter 9 is a rather dense chapter that sets up what comes next with the trip, but is also about the relationship between Bush and Angel and the wider world. We get Angel's trips into town, Husk's interest in Bush, and Bush's interest in maps as she thinks about what's coming and a potential trip. In Chapter 10, Bush and Angel travel to explain their plan to Agnes and Dora Rouge, who decide to join for their own reasons. Chapter 11 is a dense chapter as well, with 3 big parts. First, the going away party for the women. Then next, them leaving on their journey with several carloads of people coming to see them off. And the initial travel up north through nature is the third part. The last half of the chapter, we get Dora's childhood and are exposed to nature and its purpose within their culture. Chapter 12 is a stop at Bone Island with the Silver Hunters, through the exploration of Flower Island and the death of Agnes. Pay attention to Angela's time looking for the plants and roots. It's a very different section of the book. Chapter 13 has the group of ladies arrive at Two Post, and Dora doesn't recognize much of her old home. The group finds a place to stay, and Angel is able to enjoy some creature comforts. Chapter 14 gives us a vivid description from Angel's point of view of her new home. Hopefully this gives you a nice reminder of these chapters for the following discussion I had with our 2 wonderful literature and writing experts. Please enjoy as we talk about the big questions from chapters 7 through 14. Welcome to episode 2 of our summer podcast series on the academic novel Solar Storms by Linda Hogan. I am your summer host, Jared Stewart, the Region 9 coordinator and academic social media guru. And joining me again today are J.S. Khan and Yosra Buslema, who are both from the English department of the University of North Texas. I am so glad that they decided to come back and give us more of their thoughts on the academic novel. Welcome again to both of you, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Happy to be here again.
Yeah, appreciate it.
So let's dive right into chapter 7 through 14. Last time we talked about all the characters. We spent time talking about themes, and I think through that we talked about through chapters 1 through 6, because most of it's about kind of establishing the characters. But I wanted to start this time right at chapter 7 on page 106. If for those of you listening at home actually have the official ACTEC version, it's on page 106, and it says, let's see, perhaps I was remaking myself. As with the machine, I tried to put words to things over and over in the way Bush put together the skeletons. They would one day look like a living animal, with eyes of glass, clean fur, but for them, something was missing, always. The spirit was gone. They would never breathe. For me, it would be different. One day I would wake up and know that everything had started to change, that I was no longer empty space, that I had become full, or was growing toward it. So, JS and Yostra, what is Angela saying kind of about chapters 1 through 6 and this first chapter here of 7, and kind of how she has progressed and how she expects to progress? What is to come? What are your kind of reactions to that passage?
Well, I'll go first. This is at this point in the novel, it really feels that she and when I say she, I mean Angel, is really becoming acclimated. She's been with Bush for a while. And I think she's starting to realize that who you are is not something that you're going to go back and rediscover, right? It's not something that I'm not saying that that's irrelevant, because clearly she goes on the journey, it matters. But what you really end up having to do is create yourself, right? You can't set out to find yourself. Ultimately, you make yourself what you are. And what you're made of are the things that you either consciously choose to make yourself out of, or the things that you just allow to make you. And I think that's a very empowering passage in my mind for a young person to feel those things and have those
Victor,
realizations.
your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the narrator makes alludes to or like uses the imagery of putting things together more than once when she talks about her coming of age. I think there is a strong sense for her of being divided, fragmented, and she thinks of her growth as a process of putting different pieces together. Um, and I also think that she, for some reason, she feels that all the women in her life, the important women in her life, Dora, Rouge, Agnes, Bush, they're all really instrumental pieces in this process of weaving together her personal history and her, uh, you know, uh, public history, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, they
Yeah.
become part of her identity, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. These are very important relationships.
Okay, so as we go from chapter 7 on, we get kind of the planning and the beginning of this trip north. And so I'd love your thoughts on kind of each character's purpose for this trip. I think I can't remember if we talked about this off air or if it was in the last episode. But we talked about kind of how Bush's purpose was different from everyone else's. But what are your thoughts on each character's purpose for this trip?
Yeah, Bush is clearly, Bush is motivated not for necessarily personal concerns, although sure it's personal where you live, flooding, that matters, right? But she seems to have a genuine desire to stop the changes that are being made to the land by these contractors, these government contractors, and their affiliates. Angel seems almost inevitable considering Hannah and all the buildup that we even at the beginning of chapter 7 we're getting the stories concerning Hannah. Dora Rouge wanting to go back to die, that has its own logic. It makes sense from the beginning. I feel like the only person on the journey who doesn't really have a reason, again, it's Agnes, right? Who just seems to go because she has to, right? Because her mom is going and she wants to be there. But the others' reasons I found compelling, certainly.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead, Piotr.
what's striking to me is that yes, they all have reasons that we come to understand later, but Bush is the one who makes the decision, even before they
Yeah.
voice any of those reasons. I think Dora Rouge may have voiced in the past that she would like to die in her own in her homeland, but I don't think Angela expressed any interest in, or at least she didn't vocalize it to Bush that she wanted to reconnect with her mother. She did uh, I guess, show her interest in stories about her mother, which for some reason Bush was very withholding in the
Right.
beginning, which I think it's a bit, it's a bit contradictory that Bush is the one who was very withholding in the beginning. She didn't want to tell her the stories about her mom, or she wanted to tell her on her own term in her own time. And then finally, when they heard about the dam being built, that's when Bush is like, "We're gonna go because we need to be there to protest, and your mother is there, and you can, meet your mother." So it almost like it felt like it almost like it to me it felt like Bush planted the idea in everyone else's head, you know,
Yeah,
and they
I think
came to
you're right.
believe it. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree in regard to Angel. I felt the same way. It's interesting. I can understand why Bush would be wary of sharing facts about Hannah to Angel, considering how traumatic these things are and how awful
Yeah.
these stories are. I mean, we're talking about her not just which poisons a dog or something or kills a dog, but then there's also just
Yeah.
the physical abuse and the abandonment that she inflicts on her daughter. So I almost feel like in that weariness, it's almost because we see her at the very beginning of the book. She shows up in that little canoe of hers, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this, it's almost like she needed Angel to be there to even do it, maybe like to have the other excuse. But of course, that's never said out loud. I did think
Mm-hmm.
that maybe at some point. But yeah, I mean, she's the one that's like, oh yeah, and we're going to take Dora Rouge back, right? And
Yeah.
now Agnes is just roped into this in a way that it's clear that she's very reluctant to proceed. But
Hmm. So as we go through the trip, the women kind of proceed through this geography of in history, kind of almost going back in time in essence, because we're told historical stories as we go. Um,
right,
kind of all the way back to the beginning. So what are our thoughts kind of about these physical descriptions of these places like Bone Island, Flower Islands, like the choice of having them be there, like the stories behind them? What are our thoughts? And I know we touched a little bit on geography last episode, but now that we're actually in the trip here, we have some very specific places with kind of their own specific histories that are add meaning and history to kind of their journey. What are our thoughts about these various places that they kind of come upon?
I think some of them stood out more for me. Certainly, I think that they were. I mean, we move through them so quickly. Sometimes some of them we spend more time at. Which, if you can, which one was Bone Island? Where did Bone Island come first, or was it Flower Island?
Yes, Bone Island was first. That is the one, but correct me if I'm wrong here. Uh, Bone Island is the one where everyone was looking for silver that didn't exist.
That's right. Yes. Okay. The original people of North House, the first ones
Yes.
kept their dead on Bone Island. So at the beginning of
Yes.
chapter 12. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a place of death, which had some it kind of there's lots of unpacking you could do just simply with Bone Island. All the death there and all these people looking for silver that doesn't exist on a place known for death and everything else that's happening around Bone Island. Like it's just kind of a feedback loop of death, basically. But yeah, I'm sorry, you go.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, yeah. It seems. It reminds me of what you said earlier. A lot of the imagery is very loud, and
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to call an island Bone Island. It doesn't sound like, I don't know, the most inviting place. Um, it's shortly after that they go to the, what is it, the place of sleepers.
Yep. Place of
Um,
Sleepers is next.
yeah, and yeah, they just, I guess if anything, it's for me, no one place stood out a lot, but it gave me a sense of the geography of the place and its history. And, if we're traveling from, and, on these canoes, crossing all these flooding rivers, and there's all these islands, we want each island to kind of stand out, right? To kind of, um, kind of just leave its own impact as the journey progresses. I felt that the flowers, is this where Agnes passes?
Yes, that's where Angela is collecting the various, or
Right,
close to the Flower Islands.
right,
That's where she's collecting everything and kind of gets lost in this almost fever dream of looking and having to look at night and sleep during the day and not knowing how much time has passed. Kind of, so something we
right.
talked about last episode about time kind of loses some of its perceptiveness, or kind of being able to understand how much time passes. Angel goes through that when they're at Flower Island. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I remember more the story than the space, right? I remember that being a very
Okay,
harrowing
yeah.
moment, certainly. And of course, it all turns out to have been for naught, right? Because
Yeah.
she comes back and she finds Agnes, in the canoe. But yeah, for me, it was just I think the cumulative effect of this place, not this place, right? As we're passing through this flooding land, more than anything.
Right, Yosera, did any of these three places particularly stand out to you as meaningful or
I don't
offering
think
something?
the places themselves stood out. I think that in in a sense, the names of the places are very important because it's basically the one way that you can distinguish between these places is by the name. Because other than that, the whole journey or the process felt to me like being stuck in a loop, an endless
Mm.
loop, where they're like, stop at an island, do the same thing, and then they're again canoeing, another island, canoeing, another island.
I think that's
And
how Angel started to feel too. Yeah.
yeah, but also like what the other thing that stands out is how little Bush's preparation helped, because she relies too much on maps, and even Angel says this at the beginning, that the maps are full of lies and full of erasures of history, and they cannot account for the changes that happen to the land. And there were a few times I remember where Bush was confused, or more than once she'd be looking at the map and thinking, this is not supposed to be here, this is not supposed to be there, I don't know where we are, because it's not conforming to what I have here on the map. um, the other thing that I notice is how uh, we already talked about how the importance of water and water symbolism in the story, but in the journey, like, water is omnipresent, in the sense that yes, they're traveling by water, but I found it interesting that even when they were not traveling by water, even when they were on land, they were swimming in the water.
Yes.
And so they were always it, the connection to the water was maintained throughout the whole journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a line, I can't remember if it's in this part or it's closer to the end, that you reminded me of, Yosra, when you said that. But that line where it's something like, maps are masks pulled over the face of God. Right.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, not only are the maps possibly false, because like Bone Island, it's like, oh yeah, this is a place that has this, or there's the moments in the novel where the indigenous people like deceive, right, the colonizers as they're coming. But I mean, the land itself is radically changing, right? It is experiencing an accelerated kind of catastrophe, as these dams are being put up, and these you know they're detonating things, right, and redirecting rivers and tearing down whole forests. So I think, even as, yeah, you're right. Yes, right. At the beginning, we know what a how foolish it might possibly be, right? Because Angel's already kind of commenting on Bush's over reliance on these maps, which in and of themselves already are contradicting each other. So
Yeah. Would it be too much of a stretch to, because Bone Island, Sleep, and Flowers, would you, too much of a stretch to kind of connect those all back to death?
no, I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's very classical. It's just like, I mean, if Adam's Rib recalls like Genesis, and of course, there's all these great indigenous stories that are told. There's multiple accounts of the creation. They even, I mean, all contradictory but interesting. You get Dora Rouge tells one. There's the Wolverine story. There's the beaver, right? But yeah, I mean, Bones, Sleep, right? The flowers, if we're thinking of Flowers for the Dead or Elysium
Yeah.
Fields or whatever, right?
One of the other things that kind of comes up within these chapters is outside events. We hear a little bit more about events of the 1970s, the for those of you in APUS history that are listening to this, uh, that you'll learn about later in the year. The protest at is it Wounded Knee? Yes, yes. And I think they mentioned the takeover of Alcatraz, but I may be misremembering
They
that.
did actually. I
They
think
did?
there was
Okay.
a slight reference. Yeah.
Yeah. So we get these mentions of these outside events, but there's also the uh, reference of that none of what's happening in the story is getting out to the outside world. So we kind of have a blockade of information that no one knows about what's happening to the people there or with the lake, everything. Either they
Right.
don't know or they don't care, or maybe they don't care because they don't know. Um, so what is your kind of conception of the outside world beyond this novel that exists? I mean, does it? I mean, it doesn't feel very connected to the outside world other than these small moments where we get a little bit of news. And I don't know. It was just something that was interesting to me. I don't know if any of you picked up on it.
Yeah, I'll pick that up. I mean, it's interesting too because like an island, insular, right? Insula.
Yeah.
It is a very from the very beginning. When we're brought into the story through the recollections of Agnes, we already feel that we're being drawn into a space that feels not only disconnected to normal time, but yeah, the outside world. I mean, they all start by the end of the book when they're at Two Licks and they're all gathering around the radio and they're listening and they're trying to get information out about Two Post Town. I believe that's the name. But
Yes.
um, it's out there and it's occurring. If anything, for me, and I know we already talked about the characters in the first recording, but it also it helped me establish kind of why the voice of the novel was written the way it was, right? That it seems so distant because we realized that, I mean, maybe not, but we know that I know this book was published in 91. So I assume that this is written by a narrator, that this is like 30 years later. She's grown up. There's a kind of distance, right? And maybe that also accounts for some of that in the voice too. But yeah, it definitely feels outside normal time. But then that also connects back to indigenous forms of storytelling too, right? In a
Yeah.
lot of ways, right?
Good point.
Yeah, it does feel like the communities in the novel are a bit secluded, and we don't really know much about the outside world and or how they are portrayed in the dominant culture, or how their resistance is portrayed in the dominant culture. We know that they're trying to get the word out, to have their voices heard, but there isn't much that they can do. But also, despite all the blockades and despite all the attempts to divide them and disperse them, they still find ways to connect, and they still find ways to um, get the news out there. I mean, the way that Bush and the people at Adamsworth find out about the dam is because there were two men who came to town on their way, and
Yep.
they told them about that. And then later on, they find a way to let Husk know that Agnes has passed away. Larouk comes to join the resistance. There are always there are many moments where we see like small connections being made because of how tight this community is and because of how much they care about the same things and they have the same goals.
All right. Well, we now turn our attention to the student question that was sent in. We thank everyone for passing along their questions to their coaches. So this week, or this episode, we have a question from a school in the Houston area. And they asked, is there some significance to the drawings of plants beyond just being illustrations? Is there something that they should be looking at?
Yeah.
Did we spend much time looking at those there? Or is there something we should pull from that? Thoughts?
I didn't spend a lot of time looking at those, but I think the novel references those paintings somewhere at the end. Um,
I do not remember.
Of course, there was like the plant book, I think, that Dora Rouge had that's destroyed or something, or maybe it was her mother's.
Yes. Yeah.
And so thinking about that, I think about how by inscribing the images of, a text can incorporate anything, right? I mean, obviously, usually when we think of text, we think of language, but a text can incorporate images just as much. And, so when I look at these and I think about the other books that had the plants, this is the way you can identify them. It's almost as if by drawing them into the text, right? The narrator, Angel, it's like she is once again, trying to keep a tradition alive, right?
Yeah, I'm flipping through the book, looking at the illustrations here, and I'm gonna have to go back and read the end because I would like to know if there is, as Yosha brought up.
Actually, I found it as the last page.
The last page. Okay.
Yeah, the last paragraph. So one day when the light was yellow, I turned to Bush and I said, "Something wonderful lives inside me." She looked at me. "Yes," she said. "The early people knew this. That's why they painted animals on the inside of caves."
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. And I had not remember that. But then again, us three, we do not have to take a test over this book here in several months, so we were not studying this probably as closely as those of you listening will be. So yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupted you, JS.
No, well, and even then, it's still. I mean, it's a great comment because it's not directly commenting on the images, so but it is still thematically it's touching on them, right? Yeah, and if this is a first person narrative, this is a Bildungsroman, this is about Angel becoming who Angel is, and I could easily see someone making an argument that the book is to some extent Angel, right? This is who I am, right? And so if these plants, like the akitsi plants, right, that's good for headaches, and she's suddenly having these visions. Not only do the images act as proof, right? Oh, look, I actually really did have this dream, but again, I do see it as connecting her back to that tradition of drawing these plants, keeping these plants alive, letting the next generation know, and preserving the knowledge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And by the way, I realized you used the term Bildungsroman in the last episode, and I just went right by it. And I'm sure some of our high school listeners are like, "What is a Bildungsroman?" Would you, in like 30 seconds, explain what a Bildungsroman is?
Yeah, just coming of age, just a coming of age novel.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, it's a wonderful fancy word. So if you would like to learn that before you go to college, and then once you get to college, you can use that word, and people will be very impressed that you know it. So because I don't think I actually learned it. Then again, I was a history major when I started. I did not learn it until I think it was in my very first English graduate course that I had. I learned what that word meant after I was assigned to do a project on it, and I was like, okay, I will first start with looking that word up. So
a lot of books would fall under that category.
Yes, that's
probably
and it's
too
been
many.
the core of pretty much everything I've done since then is coming of age stuff, and it's a very broad category that you could almost shove probably 75% of books into. So anyway, all right. Well, thank you again to JS and Yosrid for helping us out again today. We hope you all enjoyed our second episode and exploration of these chapters. Again, stay tuned to YouTube for episode 3 of the Summerlit Podcast. Next time, we will dive into the final chapters of the book and wrap this up. Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Characters come alive, new and old tales we revive. Voices distant yet so near, in every sentence we hear. Plot twists and tales untold, heroes brave and hearts of gold. Every book a treasure chest, in each one we find our quest. Every chapter a new friend, in our story there's no end. Lost in words a world unfolds, let's get ready.